So this is why anime is beating DC. DC Comics president Jim Lee says that Japanese manga and anime is quote unquote incredibly powerful. I often find myself wondering what is missing in Western comics and why aren't they able to achieve the same flavor. I think manga has an advantage over American comics, which are mostly about superheroes, and that's where the majority of sales and readers are concentrated. In Japan, it's closer to literature and anyone can read it, and it's not just hero stories. There's a much wider range of genres, like stories about cooking and soccer. You can draw stories from that. So I'm very happy that the manga has been successful because it gives me a goal to aim for. I feel like the whole comics versus manga talk has been going on and on for many years now. Ever since we got that news report years ago that Demon Slayer at one point made more money than the entire comic book industry, that ignited the entire manga versus comic book debate. Many people feel like there is only one reason why manga is doing well, because there is no agenda pushing. But honestly, I don't think it has anything to do with the way they tell their stories in comic books, what the themes of the stories are. It is only because of one thing. When you start a series like One Piece, you can go straight to the first volume and read all of One Piece throughout. Volume 2, Volume 3, Volume 4, and so on and so forth. But with Superman, you can't quite do that. You can't just go to Superman Volume 1 because there are so many different iterations of Superman. Superman has been rebooted more times than Zora has gotten lost. So where is the casual audience even meant to begin with Superman? While the MCU was doing pretty damn well during the Infinity War and Endgame era, the success of those movies did not quite reflect on the comic book sales because of the different iterations of those characters in those stories, whereas with One Piece, the adaptation is pretty much from the manga. The anime isn't this alternative version, it is pretty much what you see in the manga. I also feel like movies that are comic book based are also having an effect on the way people view comic books now. I did say earlier on that even though the MCU was at its peak and prime in 2018 and 2019 and doing billions at the box office, it did not quite translate to the comic sales. But now that the MCU is not really looking so good now, ever since the end of Endgame, people's views on comic book stories, superheroes and all that jazz are starting to wane now. With every 6 to 7 people who watched an MCU movie like Infinity War back in 2018, maybe 1 or 2 of them were like, maybe I'll pick up a comic book. But with people's views on the MCU starting to wane more and more these days, why on earth would people want to go and pick up a comic book in the first place now? A lot of comic books tend to be very Americanized as well, and one would think, duh, of course it's Americanized, these comics are made in America. Well, the more you think about it, the more of a big deal it is. Despite Superman 2025 doing incredibly well in the American box office, it failed to attain any of that box office greatness overseas, and that is mainly due to the anti-American sentiments that he stated. He talked about this in an interview with the Rolling Stone, and I do feel like that has a certain role to play in the fall of comic book sales. Superman, as well as a lot of modern day comic books, are very Americanized. They contain American heroes fighting crimes and saving the day in America. With the way the world is now in 2026 and of course in 2025, views on America became very polarized and split, and that resulted in the box office failure internationally for Superman. It did well in the domestic box office for America, but it didn't do that well internationally. So then, is there a way for comic books to bounce back and actually be like manga in terms of popularity and sales? Well, look at manga. When a manga initially comes out, it does well, but the moment the anime adaptation comes out, the sales for the manga start to skyrocket. What American comics need is an adaptation that is well made, well executed, and is marketed as an adaptation that is based on this particular comic book. That is why movies like Dune Part 2 did pretty damn well, and I can only assume that a lot of people watching that movie will be very interested in reading the book. But when you had movies like Infinity War and Endgame that did well initially back in the day, it wasn't marketed as this is based off this particular comic book, because there are many multiple different versions of the Infinity War and Endgame books. But with Dune, there is only one Dune. But of course, that is indeed in the movie world. But that is for movies. I do feel like in TV world, however, comic books in recent years are starting to take note. Look at the success of Invincible. The TV show is making people go and read the comic book, and because it is one creator, they don't have to worry about different iterations of Invincible. Modern comic book artists need to stay true to their story and keep to their own world. Try to avoid any spin-offs and crossovers yet, and hopefully if you get an adaptation, make sure that adaptation is faithful to that comic book, marketed well, and let's see where it goes from there, mate. That is why anime and manga are king, because they only focus on one linear story, and whenever spin-offs or sequels are made, they are always made after the main story has come to an end, instead of putting a spin-off or a sequel within the main narrative, making people feel exhausted having to go back and forth watching this one and that one. Keep it long, straight and firm. That is the way to make a successful story work. I feel like the comic book industry has just made it very difficult for people to get invested into their stories when they don't even know which version of these characters they should start off with. And honestly, I don't blame them. I don't think I have ever or will ever pick up a comic book, but I will forever pick up a manga in my opinion. It's just a lot easier to get in and get out. It's very similar to reading a novel. One author with one story, you are in and then you are out. I think American comic books need to follow what novels and manga do. Make a more focused story within that world instead of constantly crossing over universes. I think that works well in the movies. It's quite fun to watch that in the cinemas, but for an intimate story like that, let's keep it to just one world at a time. I think the multiverse shenanigans make it even more confusing to be invested in these comic books. But what do you think about all of this? Well, tell me in the comments down below. Like this video, subscribe for more comic book and anime news updates, reviews, comparisons, breakdowns, rankings and more. Thank you for watching. The Second Boy Dude signing out.